Okay, welcome everyone to tonight's presentation of Understanding Youth with Safety and Risk Concerns. We're thrilled to have Dr. Khrista Boylan and Joanna Ryan with us tonight, and all of those logos under their names are all the different places that they are connected with, and we're really excited to have them here and sharing information on this really important topic to family members of all kinds who are caring for young people. So I will hand things right on over to Khrista and Joanna now, and thank you both.
You're very welcome, Louise, and I know I speak on behalf of Joanna that we're both very pleased to be here to share some knowledge tonight, and also looking forward to having some back and forth discussion if any participants would like to send us some questions and raise also some comments. We think that the knowledge that we're going to share tonight will be really applicable for parents, caregivers, family members, teachers, anyone caring for a youth who is struggling with self-harm and other related safety concerns around their well-being and whether or not they have ever had thoughts to end their life. When we intervene in this area, we can have a tremendous impact, not just on short-term suffering, but really, we believe, youth mental health for many years after we work with them now. So just a few summary points. I'm going to start. I talk for about half of our time together, and Joanna will talk for the other half of the time. And in my piece, some of the things I would like to convey is that self-harm is unfortunately common. And so we need to remember this in the settings where we work and care for kids. The other thing, though, is that it's common, but it's a signal for need for mental health support. And that's an important thing because sometimes we don't know when kids need mental health support. The other piece, which I think is quite hopeful and also supported by research, is that reducing the youth's feelings of aloneness and disconnection is actually a critical intervention. It's a necessary intervention, and it actually doesn't have to be terribly fancy to be effective. So that's, you don't need to be a doctor or a social worker to do this kind of work, but don't tell anyone. So I'll start a little bit to help you understand the extent of the problem. Use a classroom as an analogy because that's where we see groups of teenagers in the same place. So in a classroom setting, as in the general population, about a third of young people will have thoughts of suicide during adolescence. So is this rare? Absolutely not. It's very common. Doesn't mean that they'll do anything about that, but they have those thoughts. And about half of those youth who have suicidal thoughts also will harm themselves at one point or multiple points throughout their adolescent years as well. And then within that group of youth, which amounts to approximately 15% of the population, 70% of those youth will make an attempt to end their life, serious, mild, moderate severity. And then of that group of kids, there's a substantial number who make many suicide attempts throughout their adolescence and young adulthood. And my only hope would be that those youth are accessing mental health treatment because they very much need that. And to give you a visual representation, it's nothing terribly fancy, but let's say this is a classroom. The dark chairs are your youth who will have had suicidal thoughts recently. This group of kids will have engaged in some form of self-harm. This child or youth will have tried to end their life. So to clarify a bit about definitions, because this is really an important thing, however simple it actually is. Self-harm is defined as the intentional self-poisoning, so maybe taking a pill or some form of a drug, or injury to oneself that is irrespective, meaning it doesn't matter whether or not the point of doing that is to end one's life. So a subset of self-harm is suicide attempts, but much larger proportion of self-harm is not a suicide attempt. There is a term called non-suicidal self-injury that you'll see at the bottom of the slide. That refers to a type of self-harm where the intent is not to engage in suicide attempt or an act of ending one's life. And that is about as prevalent or as common as suicide attempts in young people. We can discuss this a bit more after if you have other questions, but the important message here is that it's not that half of kids do self-harm without suicide intention and the other half do. Most youth who do one also do the other, but it's at maybe a different point in time. So this is where we use a general term of self-harm to often refer to suicide attempts and non-suicide attempts or self-harm that it's not really clear why the youth is doing it, because at some point over, let's say, a year, the youth will likely engage in both types of self-harm. So we don't discriminate, we take both of them equally seriously. And I guess what that means is we can't really reassure ourselves as treatment people or family members that because the youth says they're not trying to seriously harm themselves, that harming themselves at all is better than not doing a suicide attempt. We have to really consider both as serious problems to address and talk about. This is not an advertisement for self-harm, but it's a visual demonstration of the ways that young people will harm themselves and adults. It doesn't discriminate by age. The picture in the middle is meant to represent cutting, because it's not the best picture, but it's okay. So does the razor below. That is skin cutting, and that is by far the most common type of self-harm. About 75% of people who self-harm primarily cut themselves. But there are other types of self-harm. The second most common being drug misuse. I won't say overdose. That's a complicated term. But using pills or street drugs to harm oneself. Other forms are hitting oneself or burning oneself. Other types of self-injury are much less common than those. This picture, I hope you can all see it reasonably well, but it's called the cycle of self-harm, and I use it to try to describe what we know about causation. So why do youth self-harm most of the time? And then kind of why does it continue? And then also maybe why it stops for most youth. So we start at the top. The understanding of self-harm is that it is a response to emotion, and usually only negative emotion. And negative emotions in adolescence are incredibly common at a population level, meaning that oftentimes as puberty is happening and life gets more complicated, there's a lot more negative thinking that the brain encounters. And this can be sad thoughts, angry thoughts, anxiety. And most of these thoughts are distressing. A lot of kids are able to deal with them or have somebody else help them deal with it effectively. But others don't, and they will turn to self-harming type behaviors. And why do they do this? The main reason they do it is because it can work to actually reduce the negative emotions by a variety of pathways, but the main is that it does actually provide some physical relief. There is a fair bit of research that shows that when people hurt themselves, even when they fall, let's say, and scrape their legs badly, pain reducing hormones are released by the brain. It's same with if you cut yourself on purpose. And the brain learns, or the youth learns that, hey, I'm doing this and I feel better, so I can do it again in the future if I need to. Over time, though, this pain response reduces. And so this is fortunately, in some ways, why youth stop cutting or hurting themselves, because they don't get the same emotional relief. At the same time, they can develop shame, embarrassment, guilt from doing the behavior. And so that can sometimes also reduce the likelihood of continued cutting, but more often than not, it leads to more negative feelings, which perpetuates the cycle of self-harm in a different form. So what people have observed a lot is that for some youth who continue to self-harm, they change their method. They do different things to achieve the same kind of emotional relief that they had earlier on. And that's why, as treatment professionals, we want to get into the cycle of self-harm as early as possible to break it and teach people that it's really not a good long-term option to be hurting yourself to deal with your emotions, because there is a lot of other ways to do that. So this slide is important to review. It's got a lot of stuff in it, but I will keep it relatively simple. And these three common reasons are things that people will talk about as to why they think self-harm happens for teenagers. And I can just simplify it and say that these things are generally wrong. And that's why it's important for us to understand that. And it's wrong because there's science behind why these things are wrong, even if people believe them. So I'll try to simplify them a bit. The first one is that people often feel that youth help self-harm because, people talking about it with the youth will make them want to do it more. The truth there is twofold. One is that talking about the problem acknowledges that it's there, and a lot of the times the reason the behavior continues is that no one recognizes it's there. So when a youth is confronted with hopefully a caring adult, that reduces that sense of aloneness and also validates that, I have a problem and you're seeing it, so I'm no longer invisible. So that is what helps. It doesn't make the behavior continue. The only thing that would make the behavior continue is if you were to reward the behavior. And two common ways that we unwittingly do that as caregivers is to empathize with the behavior and say, I get it. It's really hard. I can see why you would want to do that. That sometimes provides caring in a way that's confusing to the youth. And the other thing that we often may do in an unhelpful way is to provide a lot of attention for the behavior that is rewarding in and of itself, because youth do want to have attention and they do want to have caring attention from family. The second thing is when youth harm themselves, they want to die. This is a common concern that people have. I would say that youth want to do this not because they want to die. In fact, that's not usually the thought that precedes the behavior. It sometimes follows the behavior. But the main reason that they do it is because they don't have any other way to manage those negative emotions that are there. And it's more important to address that issue than it is to even talk about suicide necessarily. But in the end, for intervening, we need to do both. We need to ask about suicide, and we also need to talk about the negative feelings at the same time. Finally, they're doing it because their friends do it. There is some literature about social contagion of all kinds of adolescent behaviors, and these change over time. All that being said, if that was an important reason for young people self-harming, then, or if that was their main reason, then they would stop it really quickly, because self-harm is awful, and people don't do it because they want to fit in. Mental illness is important to recognize. And if anything, the only thing I like about self-harm is that it's a sign that there's a problem, and then we can act on that, because sometimes mental illness goes hidden. The majority of youth who self-harm have a mental disorder or multiple mental disorders, and they are in the realm of those problems around negative affect, like we talked about in the cycle of self-harm. So the main disorders that cause self-harm to persist are mood disorders like depression. And that's not probably surprising to any of us. When people are sad and hopeless, which are core features of being depressed, they will feel sad and hopeless, and that's a painful emotion. Other areas that are related to this are problems where the disorder goes along with problems with managing very intense emotions and shifty emotions that are super hard for the young person to tolerate. When kids have been in traumatic situations and experience symptoms of post-traumatic stress disorder, their emotions can be completely unpredictable and overwhelming, and sometimes self-harm serves to quiet those real intense emotional shifts for a period of time. Borderline personality disorder is a disorder of extreme emotion dysregulation. It is really common in people who self-harm with multiple different methods, and also people who self-harm and have repeated suicide attempts. And it's a complicated problem, but it's important to recognize that it's a very real illness that can be treated. And it's actually quite easy to treat in young people. So in some ways, I like to emphasize the importance of borderline personality disorder in self-harming teenagers, because a lot of doctors don't recognize that it's there. And I like to educate people that when there are youth who self-harm a lot, it might be, if you know youth like this, it might be important to raise the question to their care providers about whether they've considered borderline personality disorder as an explanation for some of the problems that the youth is having with self-harm. Many of you may know this. There are some important gender differences about self-harm. By and large, in clinical settings, the majority of young people who are presenting for help with self-harm are females. Girls are twice as likely to have suicidal thoughts and self-harm, engage in self-harm. Actually, the rate's probably even higher than that for self-harm without suicide intent. And suicide attempts are also more common in girls. What is also true is that boys are more likely to die by suicide. However, even though girls make more attempts, boys are more likely to be successful at ending their lives. So the piece that I say there is not that any of this is good news, but if you have a boy who does a lot of self-harm, it's really very important to be more vigilant about change in risk behaviors in boys, given their higher risk for completed suicide. Another very important area of clinical science is understanding the needs of transgender youth. And there's not as much research as one would think about whether or not self-harm and suicide attempts are greater in young people who are transgendered. However, there are a few studies and they suggest that rates are much higher for self-harm and suicide attempts in youth who are transgender. So in terms of treatment, this is the next part of what I want to talk about from a medical perspective and a health services perspective. I think no one would doubt that all youth who self-harm require some form of assessment of their mental health. It doesn't have to be done by a doctor, but it should be done by somebody who is capable of diagnosis and providing psychotherapy. The reason that my next section will talk more about acute care services, meaning coming into a hospital setting for care or in a crisis situation reaching out for care, is that oftentimes youth who self-harm require that level of assessment because maybe they've done something to hurt themselves and they need medical attention, or families realize that this is happening and it becomes a family crisis that a lot of families don't know how to deal with, so they will go to the hospital setting. My printer seems to want to print things right now, and I apologize for the background noise. See if I can tell it to be quiet. I don't know where this stuff is coming from. One of the things that's really important to appreciate is that presentations for young people who self-harm have really changed the way that we do mental health care in Ontario and around the world. And that is because, as you can see in this graph, this figure, this is Ontario data of all things from smaller communities. And you can see that around the time of the recession in 2008, 2009, there was a dramatic increase in the number of young people, particularly young females, who are the purple line, presenting for help around self-injury. And so what that means is that many of the youth who are coming for mental health care have had a history of visiting an emergency room, or maybe even being a patient on an inpatient unit, which changes the way that we provide care. So oftentimes, as I just mentioned, first point of service for some youth is in an emergency room. In fact, about half of youth who have their first mental health treatment come through the emergency room, and this is international data. So it's a big place for getting care first. Another place, which is probably equally good and maybe less difficult for families, is to access care through the family doctor or through the school setting. And we're privileged to have the services we have in Hamilton because I believe they are quite advanced in terms of family practice care and school care for self-harm. So some of these interventions, what do we do when people come in the door? I'm going to talk about the easier thing for me, because I don't work in the schools, is the coming into the hospital or the emergency room. And so we have our hospital, McMaster Children's Hospital, where young people are seen. And when youth come in, let's say with self-harm or a suicide attempt, about half of those youth will see they will all see an emergency doctor and have a social work assessment. So this is a pediatrician. And about half of the youth after that time will be referred to psychiatry. And we have our what's called a mental health assessment unit, which is a short stay assessment unit, which we're privileged to have at McMaster Children's. And when youth come into that unit, they will all, so as you can see on the orange side or red side, all youth will have a risk and a safety assessment to make sure that they are safe to leave the hospital. They will have crisis stabilization support to understand what it is that they need when they leave the hospital, including what the family needs to be safe, and provide also some coping skills to help manage the distress that will inevitably come over the first couple of weeks about being outside of the hospital setting. And we're also fortunate to be able to link all of our families that come in with Contact Hamilton for resource support and triage to outpatient treatment based on the level of need that they have. And as you can see on the yellow side, some of the youth, not all of the youth who see us, will be referred for more psychiatric assessment. Some might be referred for inpatient stay, but the majority won't. And those youth will be referred to, let's say, the Ron Joyce Children's Health Center or Child and Adolescent Services, or back to family physicians with the therapists in their practice to help support them. One of the things that we offer all families who come to the hospital with a suicidal youth in crisis is for them to attend the supporting parents and caregivers of youth in crisis support, I should say, education group. It's a psychoeducational treatment which is provided every week. There is one night a week that it's offered, and you can see the phone number there. I don't think any of us would turn anyone away, but this is the service that we offer to help people, mainly help caregivers in the acute period after the child's come to hospital. We're also privileged to have a follow-up clinic that Joanna was working at for a very long time, and I think is maybe working at again. And this is a clinic that provides evidence-based care, which means that studies have shown that when youth leave the emergency room, they need 1 or 2 months at least of follow-up care to make sure that they get through the high-risk period of their suicide or a suicide attempt or self-harm becoming aware to others. And this is at least a weekly support for the family, for youth, until youth are able to be connected with another outpatient care provider. So for example, if a youth comes into hospital but already has a therapist, they very well likely will not be referred to this clinic to tide them over. And then finally, but not finally, this is the next level of intervention, which would generally be a dialectical behavioral therapy informed treatment, which can help youth with two key things, one being emotion regulation skills and distress tolerance skills. There is what we call a full DBT program at Ron Joyce. Not all youth are eligible, nor do they need that program, but it is the indicated treatment for a lot of youth, particularly those who have made multiple suicide attempts. And it's a treatment that really treats and supports the family as much as the youth. But I should add, there are many other DBT-informed treatments in Hamilton through other agencies such as our Youth Wellness Center through St. Joe's, as well as the family health teams in Hamilton. I will mention a few other things briefly. One of them, as I mentioned before, is supporting a youth as a primary intervention. There has been a groundbreaking study out of the States that has shown that linking a youth up with 4 caring adults, doesn't matter who they are, who are willing to check in with this child and make sure that they are able to talk about their self-harm or suicidal thoughts, is an intervention that prevents the risk of repeated self-harm and suicide attempts. So this is why we think about how important it is to have a safety net built around the young person. Not to minimize the importance of mental health treatment, but if this safety net is there, then the mental health treatment can be far more effective. And even in the absence of that, it is protective of repeated suicide attempts. So my take-home message from my part is that treatment for self-harm is intensive. It doesn't end at the acute phase. It must continue into further follow-up. We're not talking about that a lot tonight, just in the interest of time. But it is important to have that perspective that it's not a brief intervention. Families need to be involved. They need to know about self-harm, and I'm so pleased that many of you are here tonight to learn some more about it. It's important that we monitor youth safety and making sure that they don't have access to things where they could hurt themselves or that they feel unsafe around. And I didn't get into this a lot, but I just want to emphasize it. It's part of safety planning when youth come into a crisis setting. And I can almost guarantee you that it's part of the safety planning and risk assessments that all clinicians conduct with young people when they are meeting with them. And finally, the real important piece is about connecting with the adolescent and asking them about their suicidal thoughts and behaviors as a really important early intervention. So I hand over to Joanna at this point.
Before you get going, Joanna, I'm just going to jump in, Khrista, because a couple of questions are just popping up now that that you might want to respond to, Khrista. And Joanna, your microphone was off too. I just wanted to make sure you knew that as well.
I think, so I see one question. It says, does the study say what a caring adult is? It absolutely can be an older sibling. Absolutely. Yes, absolutely. So the question is, would we share links to reliable information about self-harm? Absolutely. What I'm going to do is I will see if we can even get it added to the last slide, or I will add it at the end of the talk. Because it should be there, but it may not actually be there too. A link to an excellent website actually out of University of Guelph, which I think is very useful information.
We will go grab that, Khrista, and post that in the questions and answer discussion box, so it's connected to that question there. And we'll also make sure it's on the resource page just in case.
Thanks.
If there's any other questions, you can go ahead and type them. Joanna, if you want to go ahead and continue on. And I did notice that there was some feedback when both of you had your mics on. So, Khrista, I don't know if you want to turn your mic off now if it isn't already.
Well,
Joanna, can't hear you yet. Is your microphone button green up at the top? And green with no line on it, I should say. You're good. Okay, it's still showing as... Oh, wait, go ahead.
Can you hear me?
Yes,
Okay,
perfect. Thank
you. Sorry about the delay there. We are just going to shift things slightly. So Khrista shared a lot of information regarding self-harm, youth mental health, suicidal thoughts. I'm going to shift to kind of more practical aspects that caregivers and parents can be doing to support their loved ones. So Khrista briefly mentioned safety planning. If your young person is already connected with a mental health service provider or has been to an emergency department, it's likely that they already have a safety plan in place. However, if you're newer to mental health or this is an emerging concern, we would recommend talking to your young person about a safety plan. So I'm just going to review the 4 key components that we would want to be checking in with our young person about. So firstly, what situations are difficult for your youth? So we would really want to know what situations, emotional states could trigger or evoke a young person to think about harming themselves or think about dying. And when we know this information, it allows us to intervene and to check in with them if those particular situations arise. We also want to be talking to them about coping strategies. Ideally, this is done when the young person is not in a crisis situation, so when things are a little bit more neutral. And this always should be done collaboratively. The more buy-in a young person has or the more input, the more likely or maybe they'll be more willing to actually use those skills when they need it. And so those coping strategies will look very different for each youth. They could be skills that are provided by a clinician they're connected with. It could be an understanding that you would go for a walk with them, listen to music, some sort of distraction. So it will vary based on the youth. Environmental safety. I think what's important to note around environmental safety is if your child has thought about harming themselves, if they've thought about ending their lives, we would want to know how, and we would want to remove access to any means. Most commonly, as Khrista mentioned earlier, that might be cutting, or it could be medication, misuse of medication. And so we want to make sure that we're removing access. Of course, you're not going to be able to baby-proof a home, and no environment will be considered 100% safe. Really, the goal when we're trying to make sure the environment is safe is that we're trying to make it difficult for a young person to act impulsively if they were distressed or in a heightened state. And so we would really encourage you to have that conversation with your young person and just ask them, If there's anything within the home that feels unsafe or something that could be removed to make them feel more comfortable, it can be kind of an awkward or a difficult conversation to have, and it's really important to do so. The other piece that I should add is that we don't want removing things from the home to feel like a punishment, like they can't be trusted. It's more about the message we want to send is that we would do anything, we would take any precaution necessary to make sure that our young person is feeling safe. Crisis support. I just have the Hamilton numbers, the coast for Hamilton listed there. However, if you're accessing this video from a different community, we would definitely want you to know what's available within your local community. I think for a lot of our young people, it can be quite intimidating to access a crisis line. So one option would be for you as a caregiver with your loved one to actually call when you're not in crisis and ask the staff just to kind of walk you through what the young person could expect if they were to call in a crisis situation. We also want to be holding hope for our young people as caregivers and parents. We want to be sending the message that things can get better. When our young people are struggling, and they're struggling for a long period of time, it can be really easy for parents, caregivers, and young people to feel hopeless and helpless when it takes a long time. So we want to normalize that setbacks are completely normal. Mental health can often feel like it's one step forward and two steps back at times. So we really want to be sending the message that things will get better and holding hope for ourselves and also our young people. If your young person has thought about dying or ending their lives, we would want to know what their reasons for living are. If they are connected with a clinician already, it's likely that this has already been a conversation around their values, what's important to them, what their life worth living goals would be. And so if we have some sense of what those are for our young person, it allows us to grow and develop those further. Creating opportunities for positive experiences and things to look forward to might seem maybe self-explanatory, and we know that when our young people are experiencing thoughts about dying or thinking about harming themselves, they often have, there's this hopeless state that's involved, and it can be really difficult for them to see past the current pain that they're experiencing or past that crisis situation. So we want to be creating opportunities in the short term for them to look forward to, and this by no means has to be costly or it has to be, extravagant. It could just be things built into the week, like a movie or, their favorite dinner that they'll like. We also want to acknowledge strengths when mental health is a concern. Parents, of course, become very hyper aware of symptoms and safety concerns especially, and so we sometimes lose sight of some of the strengths or things that they're doing. And so we want to be able to balance both, that yes, they're struggling and they need support, and acknowledging the things that they are doing. Encouraging self-compassion, that really means just encouraging your young person to be kind to themselves. So reminding them that they're only human, they're doing the best they can, and that there are other people who are struggling similarly to them. Creating a toolbox, this is really to promote problem solving. It could be just an idea or a list of strategies or skills that a young person could access if they were struggling. However, it could also be more of a tangible box or items located in maybe their bedroom that they could be using. we also want to increase opportunities for connection. So our young people can give us Academy Award-winning performances that they do not want us in their lives, or they don't need us in their lives. And so they can sometimes send us the message that that kind of makes us want to back away. And when our young people are struggling, especially with safety concerns, they need us, and there's no one like a parent who will love their child the way you can, or there's no one who could support them like you can. So we really want to encourage you to connect, even if you're not necessarily getting that message from your child. If your child is someone who is quite open to candid or spontaneous check-ins around their well-being, then continue to do that. If you have a youth that might be a bit vague, or it's harder to connect to, or maybe are a bit more withdrawn, we might have to get a bit creative in the sense of asking them, how would you like me to check in with you? I want to make sure you're doing okay. I want to know if you're safe. How can I do it in a way that's most comfortable? Is there a specific time I could be checking in with you? Is there a way I could do that? Would you prefer text versus in person? So trying to get a bit creative in a way that's most comfortable for the child. And then, of course, as parents and caregivers, when you see your young person struggling, it evokes something in you. It's impossible that it wouldn't. It's so hard to watch your child struggle. And so, of course, you would have judgments and opinions and an emotional response. And so we just want to be aware of those and to be able to manage them in the moment when we're dealing with a crisis situation, or if our child is really struggling and needs us. And so it could mean just noticing it and taking that deep breath. It could be buying yourself a little bit of time and stepping away and grabbing a drink of water, using the restroom, just so that you're kind of feeling confident to approach a situation that might be quite heavy and might be quite serious if we're talking about safety-related concerns. And of course, responding with empathy and kindness. And so that's just, again, going back to the piece of your child is just a human. They're doing the best they can. You, as well as a caregiver and parent, you're doing the best you can. And I'm going to speak a little bit more to how we might empathize a little bit more. So we want to be validating our child's feelings and the challenge that they're enduring. And when I say validate, I mean putting ourselves in their shoes to understand their experience. It means acknowledging and accepting what a youth is feeling without judgment. And validation does not equal agreement. Rather, we're simply reassuring the youth that they're being heard, so we're just reflecting their experience. So, for example, I would never agree that a young person should consider self-harm. I would never agree that a young person should consider suicide. However, I could empathize and validate to try to understand why they might think about dying or why they might think about self-harming. And so I'm going to, I think it's this next slide. So I am going to show a specific model. It's a two-step emotion coaching model that really focuses on how to validate and how to provide support. And specifically, we're going to focus on safety-related concerns. So the two-step emotion coaching model is based on emotion-focused family therapy, and it was developed by Dr. Joanne Delhanty and Dr. Adele LaFrance. And so the first step, although it says validate, the first step is really check yourself. Checking yourself means checking in emotionally to see how you're doing. If we're asking you to do this really difficult task of validating or talking about emotional states like hopelessness or thoughts about wanting to harm oneself, we want you to take a second, check in to see how you're doing. Maybe it's you take a nice deep breath, and then we go to validating. After we do this validating, then we will go to support. Okay, so this is what validation might look like. So I can understand why you might feel sad. I can understand why you might think about self-harm. I could understand why you might want to cut. Because. So we want to aim for 3 because statements to provide that deep sense of validation that we are really trying to understand and get what our young people are going through. So if you notice the top sentence there says, I can understand why you might feel, think, want, blank, but. That is usually our first response. So when we are addressing an emotional concern or something that comes up with our young person, we are very tempted culturally to add the but. The but statement is usually the problem solving, or we're going to fixing, or we're going to maybe being a cheerleader. So I can understand why you might feel sad, but tomorrow will be a better day. I can understand why you might want to harm yourself, but you shouldn't. So all of us as a culture are very used to and comfortable using that but statement. I know that I catch myself doing that very, very often. We want to transform that but into because. So I can understand why you might feel sad because online schooling is so hard right now, and because you haven't seen any of your friends, and because you haven't been able to leave the house in weeks. So we are really just trying to deeply connect with our young person. I'm going to read these 4 statements, and as I read them, I encourage you all to just, even if you can close your eyes or look down, I want to encourage you just to think about what your automatic response or what your first impulse or your first reaction might be if you heard your young person say these sentences. Okay? I'll never get better. I want to die. I don't want your help. Cutting is the only thing that helps. So I'll share with you, I surveyed my colleagues and a few parents that I'm currently working with who have youth who are experiencing mental health difficulties, and I posed these 4 statements to them and asked them to just tell me their automatic response. So I want to read you them. I'll never get better. Yes, you will. Don't say that. You don't know what's ahead of you. Life is just beginning. I want to die. Why? I'd be heartbroken. Don't say that. I don't want your help. Fine. I'm trying the best I can, but you need help. Cutting is the only thing that helps. Have you tried other ways? What about your skills? I don't understand. Why would you want to hurt yourself? So I share those with you from, those are, direct quotes from families that I'm working with, but also my mental health colleagues, that this statement of I can understand why you might feel because is not our natural way of responding. We are culturally conditioned to want to fix, problem solve, and make our children feel better. So I acknowledge that when we talk about validation and emotion coaching, it is for most of us anyways, it feels like a completely new language and it feels foreign. So it's something that takes a bit of practice to feel authentic to you. So I'm just going to go through a few examples of validation. So cutting is the only thing that helps. I can understand why you would want to cut because things are really painful for you right now. Nothing else seems to be helping, and because you're just so desperate to feel better. I want to die. I can understand why you think about dying because things have been so difficult lately, and because it feels like it's not getting better. And sometimes when I try to help, I don't always say the right thing. I'll never get better. I can understand why I would feel that way because you've been struggling for so long. And because you've been working so hard. And because this is taking much longer than expected. So you'll notice in each of those examples, I'm just reflecting the young person's emotional experience, and I'm refraining from the problem solving, the fixing, the cheerleading, or trying to make it better. Okay, so those are just a few examples of what that might sound like. So that is step one, the validation. Step two is providing support, and that could be the emotional support or the practical support. What I would say is that most parents and caregivers that I work with, they feel more confident and comfortable with step two because they're just used to doing that. As parents and caregivers, they're used to providing practical support. So this, you might notice, comes a little bit more naturally. So there's emotional support and practical support. So emotional support could be providing comfort. So after we validated, we move to potentially comfort. So I'm here for you. Reassurance. It's going to be okay. Togetherness. We're in this together. Or I'm not going anywhere. Hope. Like sending that message that things will get better. Things can get better. Belief. I know you can do this. You've got this. You've been through hard things before. You can get through this. And when it comes to safety-related concerns, often we do need to provide a bit of practical support. So sometimes when a young person is experiencing something emotional or they're distressed, often, we might not always need to provide practical support. Sometimes there is no solution. Sometimes they can figure it out themselves. When it comes to safety, I think you're probably more likely to provide this practical support. So just distraction and redirection could just be suggesting another activity or encouraging them to do something else. So going for a walk, watching a movie, listening to music. Though the distraction and redirection will be more effective if you do it with your young person. So, suggesting a walk, they probably would be more likely to do that with you versus them doing that on their own. And if safety is a concern, you might want that supervision. Problem solving. There's definitely a time and a place for problem solving. So for example, it might be like, we'll talk to the school on Monday. Or, why don't you try to repair things with your friend? Why don't you call your best friend and figure it out? So you might actually want to offer some solutions after you've validated. Limit setting in relation to safety might sound like, hey, I need you to leave your door open tonight. I'm worried about you. Or, I'm sorry you can't go to your friends today. Or, I'm going to need you to come out of your room for a little bit today. So you're setting a limit or a boundary, you're making a request. And then finally, we might need to take over, which means you are taking over, you're stepping in to solve the problem. And that might be like, we need to go to the hospital, or we're calling the crisis line, or, you know, you need to come home right now. So you're really stepping in, and it's maybe less collaborative than the above ones are. So the two-step emotion coaching model, we like to use the metaphor of an elevator. So if emotion is an elevator and the door to reason is on the ground floor. So if you picture you and your young person on the ground floor, your young person is struggling. Emotionally, they're getting heightened. They're moving up toward the penthouse. Okay? And there you are, stuck on the ground floor with all of your wisdom, your lived experience, your great advice, your great problem solving. And when they're up here, they can't really hear all of that great advice that you have to share. And so the step one of validation is bringing them down so that you're on the same level, and they'll be more receptive to some of those wise suggestions you have. And so, of course, we've been talking about validating and connecting with your young person, and how to support them, how to get them services, and this is last, but certainly not least, your well-being as a caregiver or a parent is top priority. Like, I want to validate you guys because this is a really heavy topic, and it's a really hard thing to be talking about with your young person, especially. Like, we realize we're asking you to talk about self-harm, talk about suicide, manage in a crisis situation, and I'm sure you guys are probably doing those things more now than ever, given that you're spending a lot more time with your young people, just in the context of COVID-19. So I really want to take this opportunity to validate how difficult your role is, and for those of you who are tuning in, it speaks volumes that you're spending an hour connecting with us to trying to learn more, when there's probably far better things that you want to be doing or need to do with your evening. So we can't emphasize enough your priority. So taking care of your emotional health, finding ways to reduce your stress, being kind to yourself, connecting with supportive adults, and accessing counseling services if that's something that feels relevant for you. So kind of my parting message for caregivers would be, if you remember back to the self-compassion piece, how can you guys hold a bit of compassion for yourselves right now? And so that might look like remembering that you're just a human. You're doing the best you can. There's other people tuning into this presentation who are probably experiencing the same things. And we want you to be kind to yourselves, be patient with yourselves, and forgive yourself if you've maybe done things or said things that you feel like maybe weren't the best things in the moment, because we've all been there. Especially during this time, we want to make sure that caregivers are being kind to themselves. And so we will wrap up with a few services and additional supports within the community and some links. I'm just wondering if there are any particular questions about any of the material that I covered. And I'm also being mindful of the time that it's 8 o'clock. If
I can jump in a second there, Joanna. that was the one thing I forgot to say at the beginning, that the content today and the time for questions, that we might run a little bit past 8 o'clock. Of course, if people need to go, you're welcome to do that, and you can email us for follow-up afterwards. There are, I think, let's see, one of the questions that I want to make sure that you both have a chance to touch on, it's kind of in the middle of the chat a little bit, but it says, could Khrista or Joanna elaborate on how to talk about self-harm without rewarding it by empathizing, and empathizing in quotes there. And I know, Khrista, that you had touched on that a little bit, and then the validation technique that you shared, Joanna. Wondering if you both might like to talk a little bit more about that.
I think that maybe my comment was a bit too simplistic. One shouldn't not empathize with the child. I guess what I mean is many times it's not helpful to share your own experiences with the youth, especially when they're struggling to manage their own emotion. Usually they can't tolerate negative emotions from others. So not empathizing with, I understand, I've been there, that kind of stuff, that doesn't go so well. But more trying to focus on their emotion and keeping it tied to their emotion, as Joanna so beautifully gave examples of how to do that today.
Mm-hmm. And I might just add that if our young person has self-harmed, if we've noticed that, or they've shared with us that they've just self-harmed, oftentimes, I know, remembering back to the thought of what's your impulse or what's your instinct, my impulse and instinct is to check to see what the self-harm injury was. Are they okay? Are they bleeding? Or do they need medical attention? And so I think what the message we want to send is that we want to focus firstly on the emotional piece. So that validation, like, whoa, you must have had such a stressful time if this happened. Whoa, I can't even imagine what you're going through, or thank you for telling me. And then secondary, we would want to see if they needed any support from more of like a physical injury type of piece. So it's always the emotion first, and then we're checking in secondary around any of those more medical needs.
Yeah, that's a good example. I would say think about it as seeing your kid, crying a lot. If you saw that, you'd go, honey, what's wrong? So it's almost the same kind of response when you see self-injury.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And then go, are you okay? Is there any, do you need some help with that? Cleaning it up and stuff like that.
Yeah. And I noticed a comment that came through just acknowledging caregivers needing to be validated. I completely agree. And I'm wondering if Louise, who's our moderator, if she could actually post a link. There's a really nice, it's like a 5-minute guided, I don't know if you would call it a meditation, but it's like a self-compassion meditation that's specifically for caregivers, and it's it's free. It's on a website that you can access whenever. It has lots of great meditations around self-compassion for caregivers. It's with Kristen Neff, and she's been very open about how she's a caregiver of a child with autism, and she's struggled tremendously with her caregiving role. So all of her caregiving meditations have a bit of a personal connection. So I'll ask Louise to post that.
Just double checking, making sure that we're looking up the right link for that. Is there a whole series of videos for this?
Yes.
Okay. All right, we'll make sure that we grab that link and post it.
Mm-hmm. And so if any of you wanted to learn more about emotion-focused family therapy, there is some online content that you can access for free, and the link is at the bottom right here on that slide. I think they have 4 hours worth of free online content, so we would definitely encourage you to focus on that. And then, of course, at the top here, McMaster Children's Mental Health, there are a number of links for different resources within the community. Our Growing Healthy Together community education has many great resources. I'm going to assume that they're kind of temporarily postponed due to just pandemic concerns. However, usually they run year-round and sometimes have maybe some online content. I'm not quite sure about that. And then, of course, Parents for Children's Mental Health. That's Louise and Haruka can certainly speak to that, as that's a part of their role.
Yep, it's Louise here. When I have my volunteer hat on, I am one of the co-leaders for Parents for Children's Mental Health, local Hamilton group. If you're interested in getting information about the supports that we offer, I'll make sure that that link is in your follow-up email. Right now, in our current circumstances, our group is offering bi-weekly virtual support sessions for families, so every other Thursday night. So not this week, but next week would be the next one. And these links that are on the local resources slide here will all be on the resource page that will follow up with you and send that information out, and it'll include today's recording as well. I am wondering, Khrista, I know that you had provided a reply to another question that was asked earlier, and I don't know if you might want to verbally touch base on that as well, about the age that that self-harm and suicidal ideation may begin at.
The comment I had posted was around age 11 would be a typical age where we would consider self-harm to be related to the type of self-harm that we're talking about. And there's many reasons for that. The main one being emotional changes with puberty. But that doesn't mean that a child wouldn't self-harm for those similar reasons at a younger age. It would just be extremely uncommon. But self-harm can happen for other reasons like pain, boredom, developmental disability, things like being overstimulated, things like that. That's a different thing, a different problem, and it has a different treatment as well than what we're talking about tonight.
That's great. Thank you very much, Khrista. Not seeing any other new questions being added in there. So I think if anyone is thinking and wondering, go ahead and continue to post. And in the meantime, we will pull up our thank you slide. And thank you, Haruka, for getting that ready for us. We'd like to definitely say thank you to Khrista and Joanna for a really wonderful presentation tonight, and for sharing that really important and factual information that causes a lot of worry and uncertainty for family members who may be worried about a young person in their life, and these kind of unhealthy coping responses that we really want to be trying to get them connected to the help that they need, so that they can find some different ones that will help them feel better about themselves and promote their well-being. We also want to thank all of you for participating tonight, and we certainly hope to see you again. We have our next family focus session is on May 6th, and that is a Ron Joyce Children's Health Center session that is being provided by the Community Education Service, so that Growing Together guide that Joanna had mentioned. And the topic is helping my child or youth deal with stress, and definitely a good timing for that right now as well. And we definitely want to make sure that you know that our Your Space resource pages have the posted recordings of previous sessions. There was a session that was entirely about validation. We'll make sure that you've got the link for that. And there's youth sessions as well, and we're certainly hoping to be able to offer more sessions that are directly created and offered for young people on topics that are relevant to them. And we look forward to being able to support you, and so please let us know if there's topics that you would like to see. And in our follow-up email, you're going to get the link to the resource page and the recording, and there'll also be a link to a follow-up survey. And that follow-up survey really helps us know what you found helpful in this session. And family members who complete that survey are also offered an opportunity to send us their email address separate, so your survey responses are completely confidential, and that separate email lets us know that you would like to be sent our appreciation follow-up, which is a $5 e-gift card. So I'm very glad that it is an e-gift card, because that's the best thing to be sharing right now. So we are very grateful for everyone's time and attention tonight, and we look forward to seeing you again sometime soon.